Well, hi everyone, and greetings from Northern Michigan. This is Bob the Science Guy, and welcome to our continuing discussion of the Spanish flu pandemic of 1918 to 1919. In our previous episodes, we talked about the origins of the Spanish flu and how it got its name back in March 1918 at Camp Funstall in Kansas. Then we talked about the second wave of the Spanish flu, which was by far the deadliest pandemic experienced by mankind since the Black Death of the Middle Ages. Today we're going to briefly touch on the third wave of the Spanish flu and then start our discussion of the response of public health to this crisis. So let's cue up the music and get going. Now, as you may recall, the Spanish influenza was the summation of a perfect storm of conditions that led to one of the worst pandemics mankind has experienced since the Black Death of the Middle Ages. We had an avian influenza virus, a swine influenza virus. This resulted in a new strain of H1N1 influenza that was extremely contagious amongst humans. It was a relatively mild 3-day fever with a pretty low mortality rate that was known as La Grippe, or the 3-day fever, amongst the troops going off to World War I. While many troops were sickened, and it actually may have had some effect on combat readiness in the final months of World War I, it did not have a huge number of fatalities with it. Now, while this was a relatively mild influenza with few fatalities, it did incapacitate sufficient numbers of troops to actually have some impact on combat readiness in the final months of World War I. It also spread throughout the world, with the possible exception of Australia. Now, probably the biggest public health issue that we ran into during this first phase was wartime censorship and the Sedition Act. Public health officials, private physicians, and other agencies were not able to spread the news of the pandemic as they should have because of censorship laws. As a result, the first reports of the influenza pandemic didn't arrive until late summer of 1918, when that first wave was felt to be over. And as a result, widespread news of influenza was not released to the general public until late in the summer of 1918. Now, because both the Allies and the Central Powers heavily censored their press during the war, the only reports of influenza came out of neutral countries such as Spain. This is how the Spanish flu got its name, rather than being called the Kansas flu. But by the summer of 1918, everything appeared to be hunky-dory, and it was felt that it was no longer a risk to national security to release information about the flu. So basically, the initial announcements were, the flu's over. However, as viruses are prone to do, it mutated in the summer of 1918. The second wave of the Spanish influenza was characterized by a much more severe disease. It was as contagious as the first, but it was far deadlier. What's more, it seemed to prefer to strike people in the prime of their life, people 20 to 40 years of age. There was a huge spike in deaths in 1918, to the point that the average life expectancy for men and women in 1918 dropped 12 years. Now, the reason for this is twofold. First, there had been a pandemic of influenza in 1889, 90, and 91. It was much milder than the Spanish flu, but many people contracted influenza during that period of time. And as a result, people that were old enough to have been born in 1889 had a lower mortality rate than those that were younger. Now, this relatively mild pandemic in the late 1880s and early 1890s seemed to have obtained some protective effects from it for the pandemic that came 30 years later in 1918. And their mortality was a little bit lower than those that were younger than age 30 or so. A second factor that came into play was something called a cytokine storm. Much like a bee sting does not cause much actual trauma to somebody when they are stung. Sometimes the body's immune response to that bee sting overwhelms and kills the person due to something called anaphylactic shock. This is a variation of something called a cytokine storm. One of the characteristics of the second wave of the Spanish influenza was a cytokine storm. And the people that had the strongest immune systems, the young, suffered from this cytokine storm the most. Now, a third factor that increased the fatality rates in the second wave of the Spanish flu was basically the situation the world found itself in the summer of 1918. World War I was just ending. We were having Liberty Bond drives that attracted huge numbers of people into large, closely packed crowds. We had military training facilities that were stuffed to the rafters with raw troops from all over the country, being exposed to viruses and bacteria that they had never been exposed to. And then these troops were packed to the gunwales in transport ships to take them to Europe, where they lived in trenches in poor conditions for months at a time. The needs of the war were such that large-scale transportation of troops throughout the country was not halted, exposing people all along the rail lines to the disease. The Sedition Act continued to make it very difficult for people to publish warnings of the Spanish influenza. A classic example of this is the Philadelphia Naval Yard, which had an outbreak of influenza in late summer 1918. So even though local physicians tried to warn public health officials about this emerging outbreak of Spanish influenza, they were met with denial. Large-scale public gatherings, such as a Liberty Bond drive in September, were not canceled. Other public gatherings, such as movie theaters, weddings, church services, etc., were not canceled. Alarmed, the physicians wrote letters to newspapers and contacted reporters. Nobody would discuss the story for fear of running afoul of the Sedition Act of 1918, which made it a 20-year felony to publish or talk about news that somehow could hurt the war effort. Philadelphia held its war bond drive, and within a matter of days, all 31 hospitals in the Philadelphia area were full of influenza cases. But this was not the case in all locations. In cities such as St. Louis and San Francisco, stringent social distancing policies were put into place. Church services were canceled. Large public gatherings and theaters were canceled. Public health officials enforced vigorously the wearing of gauze masks to prevent the spread of the disease. So even though San Francisco and St. Louis all had cases of Spanish influenza, the peak of those cases was lower than that in Philadelphia, and it was spread out over several months. This avoided overwhelming the healthcare facilities of those communities. By Thanksgiving, people were tired of the influenza. They were tired of being cooped up in their homes. The war was ending, and they wanted to go out and celebrate. They wanted a return to normalcy, and they lobbied public officials to relax the social distancing. For those of you following the news, you see that this is a similar situation as to what we find ourselves in with COVID-19 at this time. We've all been on lockdown for the last couple of months. Many of us have not been working. We're stuck in our homes. We need a break. We want to get out. We are starting to see protests in the street about this enforcement of social distancing. Like in 1918, we are tired of being stuck in our homes. We want to get out. We want to get on with our lives. We're lobbying our public officials to relax these restrictions. Now, with the cold eye of history, we can look back to the late fall of 1918, where people found themselves in these same situations, and public officials relaxed the stay-at-home orders. We had another outbreak of Spanish influenza in December. Now, the third wave of the Spanish influenza was a serious enough illness to have been of note all on its own. The only reason that we don't talk about it as much is it came right on the tails of the second wave, which was devastating. Yes, it was a little more mild than the second wave was, but it had very significant numbers of deaths. Interestingly enough, the cities like St. Louis and San Francisco that had enforced very strict social distancing during the second wave relaxed those social distancing requirements in time for the third wave, and as a result, they blunted the effect of the second wave, but the third wave hit those cities the hardest. As devastating as the second wave was for loss of life, the consequences of the third wave of the Spanish influenza may have reached and affected history. In the spring of 1919, the warring powers gathered in Paris, France, to work out the Treaty of Versailles, which not only would end the conflict of World War I, but would shape the fate of Europe for the decades to come. When it came to the fate of Germany, there were two schools of thought. The victorious European allies who had borne the brunt of the heavy lifting during World War I, paid the highest price, favored a punitive settlement to be imposed upon the Germans. On the other side was the American president Woodrow Wilson. While the First World War was devastating to Europe, we had gone through a similar experience some 60 years before during our Civil War. As that conflict ended in 1865, there again were two schools of thought. There was a school of thought to punish the South for rebelling against the Union, to the point of not only hanging every officer in the Confederate Army, hanging the NCOs just for good measure. On the other side, there was President Abraham Lincoln, who realized that the South was part of the future of the United States, and he favored a settlement where they were welcomed back into the Union and made a part of the country going forward. Woodrow Wilson seems to have had a similar attitude towards the Central Powers following World War I. He felt that in order for Europe and the world to move forward, the settlement had to be equitable to Germany, and they needed to be welcomed back into the world community because they were going to be a part of the future of Europe. Prime Minister Clemenceau approached President Wilson with very punitive terms for the proposed Treaty of Versailles. Wilson opposed them vigorously to the point that he threatened to leave the conference and return to the United States. However, at the time, Paris was suffering an outbreak from this third wave of the Spanish influenza. 2,600 people eventually died, including one of Wilson's aides. Wilson became ill with a temperature of 102 to 103. He had delirium. His physicians were so alarmed by the symptoms that they were concerned that it may represent an assassination attempt by poisoning. Wilson was deathly ill and did not recover for nearly a week. When he was able to return to the conference, he was a changed man. He was easily distracted. He had confusion. His personality changed. And when Clemenceau approached him with the same terms again, he acquiesced. In its final form, the Treaty of Versailles was extremely harsh to Germany. It took territory. It destroyed its economy. It was a direct affront to the national pride and identity of Germany. It set up the conditions for right-wing extremist groups, such as the Nazis, to come to power. Did the Spanish flu cause World War II? No more than it ended World War I. But it certainly did not help in either case. Now, in closing, one of the final victims of the third wave of the Spanish influenza was the founder of my profession. Sir William Osler was a Canadian physician, and with 3 others, founded the Johns Hopkins Hospital in Baltimore, Maryland. He was a minimalist when it came to treating patients. He felt that doctors sometimes did more harm to patients than their diseases did. And one of the overwhelming lessons that he infused in his students and those of us that are the descendants of his students is to re-inject humanity into medicine. His condition steadily worsened over the weeks, and he died of the disease on December 29, 1919. Shortly before his death, he was asked by a reporter what he thought of the Spanish influenza. What he proceeded to say was probably the most Canadian thing that I've ever heard in my life. He said he had a very interesting case that he had been following for 2 months. His only regret was that he wouldn't be able to witness the postmortem. That pretty much defines grace under pressure and professionalism. So this is Bob the Science Guy signing out from Northern Michigan. In our next episode, we're going to go on to the second phase of my discussion of the Spanish influenza, and that is the response of public health in 1918 and some of the parallels to the response of public health here with the COVID-19 virus. I hope that you'll hit that like and subscribe down at the bottom, maybe ring that bell icon, or even consider joining the channel as a member. It's pretty cheap and gives you some cool stuff that you can do. In the meantime, y'all take care, stay healthy, and thank you again for stopping by and for supporting this channel.